Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite the Honorable Mangala Samaraweera, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the Board of Management of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute, to deliver the welcome address.
Venerable Maduluave Sobitatero, members of the clergy, our chief guest today, the Right Honourable Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Madam Cherry Blair, President Chandrika Kumaratunga, Mrs. Suganthee Kadirgamar, members of the board of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute for International Relations and Strategic Studies, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor today, as the chairman of the board of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute, to speak a little about my late cabinet colleague, Mr. Lakshman Kadirgamar, and also introduce our guest speaker, the Right Honourable Tony Blair. Ladies and gentlemen, on 12th August 2005, 10 years ago, this country lost one of her illustrious sons, the Honourable Lakshman Kadirgamar. A fearless critic of terrorism, he courted death from the moment he took over the portfolio of foreign affairs in those challenging days in our country. Finally, 10 years ago, a sniper's bullet managed to silence him forever. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Kadirgamar was much loved and much admired foreign minister of our country. He earned the respect and admiration of his counterparts, leaders of foreign countries, those of us who were honored to be his colleagues in cabinet at the time, and all those who had the pleasure of meeting him. Bestowed perhaps with a prophetic view of evolving global threats, he warned Western democracies well before 9/11 that they were being too passive about the activities of terrorist organizations, especially their fundraising and planning activities. A firm believer in democracy for both developing and developed countries, he cautioned the democracies of the world that terrorists were taking advantage of the very freedom and space which democracy allows to destroy those systems. He urged that the democracies of the world must stand together to fight this scourge, lest we should lose the values, principles, and freedoms that we cherish the most. It was during his tenure as Minister of Foreign Affairs that the funding for the LTT in Western countries, including in the United Kingdom in 2001, when you were Prime Minister, sir, was stopped through effective legislation. That in fact marked the beginning of the end for the LTT. However, at times, Lakshman has been misunderstood by some who claim that he believed in a military solution. This is far from the truth. Having had the honor of knowing him and working closely with him, I can confidently say that Lakshman did not believe that there was a military solution to the crisis that this country faced. He was a firm believer in human rights, and he was a firm believer in democracy. In fact, he was the first person in the world in 1963 to conduct an Amnesty International investigation in a country, which was Cambodia. He always believed in a political solution and the importance of addressing the grievances of the Tamil community. In fact, I recall his speech to this effect at the launch of the Sudunelu movement on the 10th April in 1997, where he spoke at length about the suffering that the Tamil people have endured over the years. He spoke about the importance of achieving for all people in this country freedom not only from want, poverty and hunger, but the freedom of spirit, and he urged that political leaders to adopt a bipartisan consensual approach to the political solution of the conflict that has plagued our country. As a firm believer in upholding human rights, I recall how, when he took over as Minister of Foreign Affairs, he worked tirelessly on releasing detainees, taking on this task almost personally together with the Attorney General at the time. His efforts in ensuring Sri Lanka's accession to the optional protocol of the ICCPR and his emphasis on the need to adhere to human rights principles, the rule of law and good governance are well known. So were his efforts at constitution making based on principles of equality to all. In an address to the Kotalavala Defense Academy in October 2000, he set out the role of the soldier in a democratic society. He emphasized the need for human rights and humanitarian law to be observed by the government and the armed forces, even in difficult circumstances of hostilities. He cautioned the soldier, and I quote, "When the day comes, and I believe it will come, for the armed forces to lay down their arms because they have done their duty and won their battles, the peace that is going to be constructed basically by civilians will be rendered possible only if the armed forces have seen to it that in fighting the war, they also respected and had regard for, and wherever possible, looked after, cared for, and tendered the civilians who in those difficult times were geographically on the side of the enemy. That is a difficult task, but a task profoundly worthy of your best attention, your unflinching attention at all times, bearing in mind the supreme responsibility that you have not only for seeing to it that the country remains whole, but that the country remains ultimately united. Let us never have to rue the day when we won the war, but lost the peace which the war was fought," unquote. Lakshman, as we all know, abhorred terrorism, but he was a humanitarian, a realist, but at the same time an idealist. He articulated his vision for Sri Lanka many times. I will quote from just one instance where he said, "I believe that all our peoples can live together. They did live together. I think they must learn to live together after this trauma is over. I see no reason why the major races in this country, the Tamils and Sinhalese and the Muslims cannot again build a relationship of confidence and trust. That is my belief. That is what I wished for, and in working for that, I will not be deterred," unquote. Had he been alive in May 2009, ladies and gentlemen, when the armed conflict ended, he would have, I'm sure, prevailed upon the government in power not to squander away the opportunity for durable peace by adopting a triumphalist approach. He would have advocated a consultative, collaborative, and truth-seeking trajectory that is essential in our post-conflict situation. It is a pity that Lakshman did not live to see the end of conflict. We are poorer today, in a sense, without the benefit of his wisdom, when we need it most as we embark on a journey towards reconciliation and lasting peace, and we seek to set our nation firmly on the path of democracy, ethnic harmony, rule of law, and good governance. The twin electoral victories of 8 January and the 17th of August, achieved by the people of this country through democratic means, has enabled us today to reinvigorate our democratic systems, strengthen institutions, and take our country on a path of development and progress while achieving lasting and meaningful reconciliation and peace building. Ladies and gentlemen, it is in this backdrop that we have today a very special person to deliver the 10th Lakshman Kadirgamar commemoration lecture with us today, the Right Honourable Tony Blair, the longest serving Prime Minister, the Labour Prime Minister, I believe, in the United Kingdom. And something that stands out in Mr. Blair's tenure as Prime Minister would have interested Lakshman deeply, and that is his role in the Northern Ireland peace process, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement negotiations, which paved the way for the political settlement between Sinn Féin and DUP. In the foreword to a book by Alistair Campbell, Mr. Blair ascribes his success as conflict mediator to empathy skills He writes, I quote, "In a conflict there is suffering of a nature and on a scale that we from the outside can scarcely appreciate because it's not within our experience. Each side has a sense of pain and of cruel consequence from the other side's action." Mr. Tony Blair, during his tenure at the helm of the British government, was compelled to respond when the world was convulsed with unprecedented threat to international peace and security by actors who did not respect international norms, values, and agreed conventions. By virtue of his office, he was required to take proactive measures not only on behalf of his own country, but for the sake of international peace and stability across the globe. I'm grateful to Honorable Tony Blair for agreeing to speak to us today at the end of a private visit to Sri Lanka and share his experiences in resolving the complex conflict in Northern Ireland. This lecture comes at a very propitious time when Sri Lanka is embarking on a journey of achieving reconciliation and a durable peace, and I'm sure that there will be much that Sri Lanka can draw from the Northern Ireland experience. Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Tony Blair is too well known for lengthy introduction, so let me now, in my capacity as the chairman of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute, invite Honorable Tony Blair to deliver this year's Lakshman Kadirgamar Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mangala. It's a great pleasure and honor to be giving this Lakshman Kadirgamar lecture at this institute that now bears his name. Before I say anything else, though, I should say one thing at the conclusion of 2 weeks vacation here. I love Sri Lanka. This is a truly amazing country, and we have had the best time. So I didn't ever think I was going to be able to come here without giving a speech. I have to say the last 2 weeks have been bliss because they've been free from speeches. But I did, when I was asked to do this speech, I wanted to do it not simply as a mark of respect to the country, but as a mark of respect to Lakshman and all that he achieved and accomplished. He was a brilliant lawyer, and I know something about brilliant lawyers since I'm married to one. He was a distinguished statesman. He was also renowned internationally. When he died so tragically 10 years ago, the outpouring of respect and admiration for his life did not just come from Sri Lanka, but his many friends and admirers around the world paid tribute to all that he had achieved in his life, not just for this country, but for the cause of peace. He was a huge believer in and practitioner of also equality between people of different faiths and religions, something that fascinates me and occupies a large part of the work that I do today. He believed in a Sri Lanka in which all people were equal under one law. So, Mrs. Kadirgamar, thank you so much for having me give this lecture in honor of your husband, and it really is a genuine honor to be here with you, with so many distinguished members of society in Sri Lanka, and to offer you my thoughts at this very important moment, almost this junction between the past and the future, where Sri Lanka presently finds itself. I'm just back, in fact, from the Middle East. That was my one break in my holiday. I went back to the Middle East for a couple of days where I tried to make a contribution to the peace process there. This was actually I think it's now my 150th visit to Jerusalem since leaving office. Although Shri once pointed out to me, it's not actually the number of visits you make, it's the progress that counts. Which I didn't think at the time was very supportive, by the way, but it's unfortunately true. So not all peace processes end in success, or at least it can take some a very long time to succeed. But in the experience of Northern Ireland, we did. But it's worth pointing out that we succeeded after, well, on some calculations, decades of conflict, on other calculations, centuries of conflict on the island of Ireland. And there's an important lesson in itself for realizing that however tough things seem and however intractable problems appear, it is always worth striving for peace, because you never know that moment at which peace suddenly becomes possible. Here in Sri Lanka for many, many years, you had conflict of a terrifying nature in which so many innocent people lost their lives. Today, the conflict has ended and the pursuit of reconciliation has begun. Now, each conflict always has its own characteristics. And therefore, when you compare, for example, the experience in Northern Ireland with the experience in Sri Lanka, you have to do so with some caution, because the circumstances are so different. But having had experience now of different parts of the world since leaving office, including but not limited to the Middle East, it's true that conflicts come in a range of different circumstances and with an array of different characteristics. But it's also true that peacemaking and reconciliation has some characteristics that are common to whatever circumstances you find yourself in, or whatever the origins of conflict were. And with peace comes enormous opportunity. And we see this and we can feel this. Just as visitors to Sri Lanka today, we can feel the sense of possibility in the air. And I think it's important for the country, and sometimes you need someone from outside to tell you there is a huge excitement about where Sri Lanka can go. So in your pursuit of reconciliation, you have many long-standing friends who want this to succeed, but you also have new areas of interest in the country and in what it can do from around the world. Even in these 2 weeks that we have been here, certain things are very clear. This country has remarkable beauty and a remarkable variety of beauty. It's got an extraordinary history. When we went to see Anuradhapura, I'm not sure about the pronunciation there, but anyway, but this extraordinary ancient civilization, now in the process of being excavated, and as each stage of the excavation proceeds, we see the quality of the civilization. It's a remarkable thing. And actually, when I went back and was talking to people in that couple of days I spent in the Middle East, and I was telling people there about the city and the rock with the presidential palace on top. I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong again, but you know the one I'm talking about. So good. Yeah. that one. So, and you see the extraordinary way that they built that palace and that whole civilization around it. And 2 million people living in the main city all those centuries ago. So the history of this country is a history that is profound and would be a subject of fascination to people coming here. You have natural wealth in resources, many different resources. And for the British, most important, tea. Look, because I travel the world today, I travel the world trying to get a decent cup of tea. You know, because the British we care about tea. You care about tea, okay? And most places you go in the world, they may think they're great countries, but they don't know anything about tea. You know, you go to I won't mention any names, superpowers, roughly 50 or so states in it, and you get your tea and you think, it looks like dishwater. And then you taste it, and it tastes like it too. So to come here and have a decent cup of tea, that's such a blessing. But you've got this abundance of resources. You've got obviously fantastic potential in tourism. But you've also got trade agreements with your neighbors that offer amazing opportunities for business to come and invest and locate here. And then, of course, most important of all, for any country in the world today, you have your biggest resource, which is your people, who are kind, who are generous, and who want the best for their country. So there's so much to be proud of and so much to hope for. Yet for decades, this country, despite all its beauty and its history and its resources and its potential, it was defined by conflict. And conflict is always hard and bloody and unforgiving. So, right now, as peace has come, we have to look upon this as a supreme moment of opportunity and possibility. But we have to recognize one other thing, which the Minister, Mangala, did so well in his introduction. The peace is a beginning. The peace gives you the chance to create something new. It doesn't in itself create it. When we did that Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland in 1998, it actually took us another 9 years before Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness sat down in government together. And throughout that period of time, there were ups and downs and difficulties and crises and times when we thought it wasn't going to be possible. So when there is peace, you have the opportunity. But the opportunity's got to be seized, because reconciliation won't come unless there is much more work. So I could identify, I think, based on my experience, not just in Northern Ireland, but elsewhere, I would identify, I think, 7 principles of successful reconciliation. The first is the continued absence of conflict is essential. I know it sounds a statement of the obvious, but it's very, very important. Security matters. You know, Lakshman understood this very well. This is why he spent so much time and energy, and to such great purpose, on waking the world up to the LTTE. And we have to say constantly, as we pursue reconciliation, and when people still feel a sense of grievance, as is inevitable, we have to say, whatever your grievance, whatever your disagreements are, nothing justifies the acts of terrorism. So to make peace last, that cycle of violence has to be put into permanent suspense. Because what terrorism does is it is not the act of terrorism in itself that is wrong, simply. Of course it's wrong. But what it does is it creates division. It creates a reaction. I've never come across a situation anywhere in the world where once there is terrorism, then there's not a reaction from the forces of authority, and then there's a reaction to the reaction. And so it goes on. And that's why you can't reconcile where there's violence. What we had to understand in the Northern Ireland situation was the first thing we did was to create the circumstances in which the violence stopped. But we then had to create the circumstances in which it carried on stopping. And that wasn't easy, but it was absolutely essential. And if we hadn't done it, we wouldn't be in the position we are today. And right now, of course, we see the terrorism around the world. And I could take any of the terrorism hotspots anywhere in the world, and I can promise you one thing: a majority of people in any of those countries don't want it. They don't want it. Even in the places you may think are the most war-torn, out in the Middle East now, places like the north of Nigeria. And actually, in any of these places, the vast majority of people don't want it. But what the terrorism can do is it can create such sectarian division within a community that even if people don't want it and don't like it, they get caught up in it. So this is for reconciliation to succeed. Never lose sight of the fact. The very basis of it is the absence of conflict, and that has to be maintained. The second thing is that once that happens, then you need a framework for the future that is fair. And let me explain what I mean by that. In a conflict, there will be disputes, disagreements, divisions. That's why there's been the conflict. But if you want to resolve the conflict on a basis that's sustainable, you need what I call a conceptual framework that allows people to understand the nature of the accord that's being offered to them. In a sense, what's the deal? Okay, what do we say is going to, what is the framework that governs our view of the future? In Northern Ireland, for example, the conceptual framework was very simple. We said, okay, you have a Republican movement that believes in a united Ireland, and you've got a unionist movement that believes in Northern Ireland remaining part of the UK. So the conceptual framework we adopted was to say, whilst the majority of people want Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK, the principle of consent applies and that majority decision applies. Okay. And of course, that means at this time that Northern Ireland remains part of the UK. But we said alongside that, however, in return for that, under the law, people are going to be treated equally. Because for a long time, there's a large feeling in the nationalist and Republican, the Catholic communities, that they weren't. So we had a conceptual framework, the principle of consent balanced by equal treatment. In the Middle East, it's land for peace, 2 states for 2 peoples. Now, the problem in getting there is vast, of course. But actually, the conceptual framework is quite simple. And one of the things, by the way, that's most frustrating about the Middle East is in the case of Northern Ireland, there is still no basic agreement as to whether United Kingdom or United Ireland. But we found a framework that people can see is sufficiently fair that they're prepared to manage that disagreement within that framework. In the Middle East, what is frustrating is there is actually in principle agreement, 2 states for 2 peoples. But the facts on the ground contradict the hope of peace. Now, for Sri Lanka, you will have to work out your own framework for the future. I mean, obviously, you know better than me the main issues that go into that. Issues around devolution, around the guarantees of rights, around development, and around dignity and fair treatment. But the second principle is really you can end the conflict of the past, but you can't get reconciliation for the future unless there is a fair framework at the heart of it that's fair and seen to be fair, and that allows disputes and disagreements and divisions then to happen within a normal political process and not in a cycle of violence. The third principle is that particularly in circumstances where conflict has involved different faiths or different ethnicities or different parts of a country, for the conflict to be resolved finally and for reconciliation to work, 2 things must be in balance, and that is unity and diversity. And this is, again, a very, very important thing from around the world. You see, what happens today in the era of globalization is that the world gets pushed closer together. You know, it's a cliche now about the global community, but it's a cliche because it's true. Migration is pushing us together, travel is pushing us together. Everyone's got their devices, the little mobiles, and I don't know, all that technology pushes us together. So people across boundaries of race and nation and faith and culture are today mixing and mingling in a way that is on an epic scale compared with previous times. And this will only happen more. So if you take the City of London, you know, when I first went to the City of London many years ago, and when I was brought up, for example, in the northeast of the UK in County Durham, communities were very homogenous. You know, communities were very similar. There wasn't a lot of mixing and mingling. But you go to London today, and it's an explosion of different cultures. I mean, it's done a lot for us, particularly on the cooking front. But it's, you know, London today is a vibrant, successful city precisely because of its diversity. However, here's the thing about diversity. You have to recognize difference, and personally, I believe we should celebrate diversity, but we should do so recognizing that there also has to be a common space in which all the different groups come and which is governed by common and shared principles and values. So one of the issues right now, for example, in countries like Britain, other countries in Europe the same, it's that parts, for example, of our Muslim communities sometimes feel apart from the rest of society. And that common space isn't there. Now, when that common space is not agreed upon and shared, that becomes very difficult. So, if reconciliation is to work, you have to recognize that you're bringing together people who are disparate and different, but you're bringing them together within a polity in the nation that is unified, where some values, democracy, freedom, I would add to that equal rights of women, where these are values that someone can't say, well, I'm afraid my culture doesn't allow that. No. In my view, if you want to be part, for example, of the UK, these are values we all share in common. Now, you may worship in your way and I may worship in my way. I may have my cultural views and practices, and you may have yours. You know, like Sri Lanka and the UK, we share a love of cricket. But I don't know whether you've ever tried explaining cricket to anyone who's American or from outside the... Anyway, don't start there. I think 5 days for a match, they find a curious concept. Okay, we have got our different practices, our different ways of life, but in the UK setting, in my view, it's absolutely essential that that common space exists, and in that common space, everyone signs up. Because that's what keeps the nation together. And Lakshman actually had a very clear, I've read some of his speeches and some of his statements on these issues. And of course, himself, very interesting as a Tamil. But he was someone who believed passionately in religious freedom, but also in religious freedom within a nation of shared values. And this, I think, is hugely important. Religious freedom today is one of the great causes, actually. We face enormous amounts of religious extremism. Now, I mentioned radical Islam, but you can look at any religion and find its share of extremists and people who incredibly take the faith who's in all the major faiths, many of the same principles of compassion and belief in a common humanity and do to others as you would have them do unto you. It's always extraordinary how religion can be then warped and turned into an instrument of violence or conflict, but it happens. And it happens a lot. So this is something that is fundamental to the pursuit of reconciliation. That just as the world develops in this way and more people mix together across the boundaries of faith and culture, so we have to balance that unity and that diversity. My foundation actually works on interfaith relationships in about 20 different countries in the world. And there's a huge need for these principles at the moment, but particularly when there's been a conflict that has ethnic dimensions to it, this is essential. And that balance between unity and diversity has to be got right. The fourth principle is because conflict creates much dislocation, poverty, despair, because, of course, when there is conflict, it's impossible to build an economy, to have people with the jobs and industry of the future. Because of all of this, economic development helps. Now, economic development is never a substitute for all the politics. So let me make that very clear. But I have to say, in the case of Northern Ireland, it helped. The fact that investment was going in, it helped. Now, these things all relate to each other. As the security improves, people will come and locate and invest. And then as they invest, the people get a stake in the future. I don't ever believe that despair can be turned into an excuse for violence. But I do think it can be an explanation for at least part of it. So where there is some economic development, there is a real prospect. And therefore, one part of this, one dimension of reconciliation, is to give that economic opportunity and hope, particularly to the young people. I mean, in the Middle East, as things have evolved over time, and the wealth disparity between Israelis and Palestinians has grown enormous, now 10, 15 times. The gap between incomes and Palestine incomes in Israel, this is not propitious for bringing about reconciliation and peace. And if the economy stagnates and large numbers of young people don't feel they've got any, they've got any stake in the future, then it becomes much harder for reconciliation to take root. So the fourth principle is that economic development is not a substitute, but it surely helps. The fifth is education. I mean, I'm one of those people that believes education is virtually a cure for everything, so I'm slightly obsessive on this. You have to aim off a little bit for this. But I do believe that the more our young people are educated, and educated about the world in which they're going to grow up, the easier it is to pursue reconciliation. Now, that is particularly true today, because the whole point about education is not just to sit children in front of a teacher in a classroom, but it's to educate them for the world that they're going to grow up in. And, I always say in many of the different countries I work with, presidents or prime ministers, I say the key is to get your people connected. It's to open their eyes as to the opportunities that are out there, and also to make them understand that around the world today, young people are struggling with the same things and for the same types of opportunity, but you succeed today if you can get connected. And the education systems of countries should not be just about the quantities of kids going into the class or just basic literacy and numeracy. The children have got to be educated also for what I call the open mind. Because if you think about it today, you succeed economically if you are prepared to be open-minded towards people who are different. So if you've got this force of globalization pushing the world together, those people that haven't got the educational attainment or ability to understand different faiths, different cultures, the way the world's developing, they're going to be at a big disadvantage. So education is, again, absolutely critical. An education that specifically tries to educate our young people to be open-minded, tolerant towards others, respectful of difference. In Northern Ireland, we put a lot of effort into it. I'm not sure still that we always succeed in the way we need to. But the extremism is usually taught. It's not natural. And it can be untaught, by the way. But it's better if we're teaching right from the beginning, according to a curriculum and according to a school organization that puts right at the center of that education, the education for the open mind. And that leads to the sixth principle, which is dialogue. The dialogue has to be deep, it has to be inclusive, and it has to be constant. All the time, we have to recognize the importance, even after there is peace, even when you put the framework that I described for the future that is fair in place. You need a constant process of interaction, of dialogue, of understanding, of people working out their differences together. Because one of the things that happens in a conflict, and I've seen this again all over the world, is that people don't see each other's pain. They know about their pain, and they feel it very deeply, but they don't see the other person's. I come across this all the time, and it was very interesting in Northern Ireland, as we got the framework in place and as we proceeded, those mechanisms that brought people together so that they understood that their pain was mirrored by the pain of the other person on the other side, it was a really important part of getting people to understand that reconciliation isn't just about laws and constitutions and processes. It's got to touch the heart. If it doesn't touch the heart, it doesn't really work. And that dialogue is really important. We found this in Northern Ireland. Actually, in the Middle East, today in the Middle East peace process, about the only good news is that there are those institutions of dialogue at civic society level, even amongst business people, amongst young people, where they're able to see that the person on the other side is not so very different. You know, a completely different person with a completely different psychology. Actually, it's just the mirror image on the opposite side. So the dialogue has to be deep, it has to be inclusive, it has to be constant. And that brings me to the final principle, which is in many ways the most difficult and the most sensitive, is that the past and the pain that it caused cannot be erased and is not forgotten. But it can be confined in some way so that it does not disrupt the possibilities of hope for the future. And where the past is examined, it should be examined for the truth, but not for retribution. Conflict creates victims. And their pain never leaves them. I mean, many of the people in this room not least Mrs. Kadirgamar herself, know about the pain of bereavement and the suffering that goes with it. And for the people who are left behind, their memories never dim. And for them, the past is in one sense the present and the future. So when we try to pursue reconciliation, always one of the most difficult aspects is what do you do about the past? And the conversations I had that I think were more difficult than any other in the course of the Northern Ireland peace process was when I would sit with the victims of the violence on both sides, who felt that their truth had never been properly told, that they never really brought closure to the pain that they faced and suffered. And they would be very critical of what they thought was a political process that seemed to them all the time to be somehow diminishing or relegating their grief. And I used to say, very often, I'm trying to do this because I want future generations to be released from the grief and the suffering that you feel. And occasionally, and I remember, this is an interesting reflection on the Northern Ireland peace process, actually the very worst single act of terrorism happened after the Good Friday Agreement. And it happened in circumstances where it was looked as if at that moment it was going to disrupt the whole of the Northern Ireland peace process. And I remember visiting the families of the victims. And some were just too torn apart by grief to speak. But one man who'd lost his child said to me, there will be people who tell you that now you should stop. He said, I'm telling you now you should carry on in order that parents in the future do not feel as I feel today. So this process of reconciliation, it will inevitably involve an examination of the past and a hearing of that grief and that anguish. And countries have done it in different ways around the world. I mean, Rwanda, for example, did it through a remarkable series of gacaca courts, which were specific courts brought about after the genocide, where people would exchange their feelings one with the other. In South Africa, you had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Northern Ireland, for example, we instituted an inquiry into one of the worst events that was deemed and called Bloody Sunday, and it was an event that had caused deep anger and alienation within the Catholic community. It's very difficult. The inquiry went on a very, very long time. But we were trying in a way to get people to understand what they'd been through and what they felt as a way of helping them overcome this. So you will have to find your own way to do this, but whatever way it is, consistent with your own sovereignty, it has to be credible and thorough, and it has to succeed in allowing people to feel that they've been heard about the past in order to allow them to enter into the future. But the purpose, in my view, of any such process should be to solve the anger and not to stir it. So it's very important the way that it is set up and the way that it is done. So those are some of the things that I learned in the course of the Northern Ireland peace process, and indeed in the course of other attempts at peacemaking in different parts of the world. Some final thoughts are these. I think there's a methodology in reconciliation. Get good people in charge of it. That's true of all government, by the way, in any walk of government. But good people. Make sure it's organized. In Northern Ireland, for example, we had a whole series of reforms and changes we needed to get done. You've got to organize the doing of it. Make sure it's done competently and fairly. You've got to realize that some people will try and disrupt things. There'll always be people out there who know that the quickest way to whip up an audience is to play to their fears, play to their insecurity, play to their sense of grievance, try and create a situation of tension. The system's got to be strong enough, and people have got to be strong enough to overcome that. And actually, your recent election was important, I think. And finally, you've got to persevere. You know, one of the things I always say to people about reconciliation and peacemaking is just don't give up. I mean, keep persevering. I remember when I first came into power, on the 1st of May 1997, and I decided to make Northern Ireland peace process a major part of the government's program. And there were some older and wiser people who said to me, well, you're crazy. It's never going to work. I mean, they all hate each other. Just leave that to one side. We just manage that as we can. So we didn't really ever think we'd get, you know, when you're going through the conflict year after year, you kind of think you're never going to get to peace, but then you do. But then afterwards, you've got all these other things, the nitty-gritty of how you get it all done. Persevere is my final piece of advice. And, you know, you can persevere secure in one very clear understanding, which I'm sure is true about Sri Lanka and is true in all the different parts of the world that I know today. You know, there are different cultures and different faiths, and people grow up in different ways. But some things I notice are the same everywhere. People would prefer to live in a society where they can bring up their children with some peace and security. They would prefer to live in a country in which, if they work hard by their own merits, they can succeed. They would prefer that the rule of law decides any disagreements they have, and that rule of law is impartially administered. They would prefer to have their government underneath them and not on top of them. And they would prefer to live in an environment in which they can get on with their neighbor, whoever their neighbor may be. Now, I actually think these are universal values. Many, many people never get the chance to live in such societies, but they do want to. And sometimes, you know, when people talk about these values as if they're kind of Western, well, they're not Western, they're not Eastern, they're not anything other than the type of values people choose when they're free to choose them. So you can pursue this reconciliation here in Sri Lanka knowing two things: knowing that this is a wonderful country with a rich history and tremendous possibility for the future. And you can pursue it knowing that in doing so, you are meeting the aspirations and the ambitions and the desires of the overwhelming majority of people, whether they're Tamil or they're Muslim or they're Christian or they're Sinhalese or whatever. You know, you can do that knowing that you're meeting the deep-rooted wish in the heart of your people that this peace is maintained and that reconciliation comes to this country, because if its people feel that and feel part of one country, then there is nothing that this country cannot achieve for itself. No ambition that it sets that it cannot fulfill. No potential that is there that lies barren and not cultivated. So this is a great moment of opportunity. We've had a wonderful time here. People have been so generous and so kind to us. But most of all, as I leave Sri Lanka, I feel a great sense of excitement and hope about its future. And perhaps more than anything else, I can't wait to come back. Thank you.
I thank the Right Honourable Tony Blair for delivering the 10th.
The theme chosen by you for the lecture on reconciliation, Northern Ireland experience, was an area that Lakshman was interested in. Lakshman spoke on this very subject on 29 July 2005 in Colombo, just a day after the IRA ordered an end to its decade-old armed campaign with the beginning of the long and complex procedure of laying down arms. People of Sri Lanka, I'm sure, will remember with a deep sense of appreciation that the LTT was declared a terrorist organization and therefore banned in the United Kingdom under your administration. Lakshman was grateful to you your government, and all those influential people in the United Kingdom whom he strenuously lobbied to have that ban imposed. After his assassination by the LTT, it was your government that joined the European Union ban of that terrorist organization. Madam Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga, thank you very much for your presence here today. Mrs. Blair, you may recall our first meeting at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Scotland back in 1997. Thank you very much, Mrs. Blair, for gracing this occasion. Honorable Mangala Samaraweera, thank you very much for the initiative you took to make this memorial lecture a reality. Your unstinted support for the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies is very much appreciated. May I also thank the Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Chitrangani Vagiswara, and the staff of the ministry for all the assistance rendered. Thank you, Dr. Chanaka Talpaheva, Acting High Commissioner for Sri Lanka in the UK, for all your efforts to make this lecture a success. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence here today for the Lakshman Kadirgamar Memorial Lecture.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this ceremony, but I would kindly request you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to remain seated until...
Sorry.
Well, you want to speak after we leave. Okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's my fault. Got bad advice from the British.